My daughter's in-laws had no idea the man they offered $15,000 to disappear from their lives held the controlling interest in the private lending fund behind their entire real estate empire. They looked at my Carhartt jacket, my calloused hands, the rust eating at the rear wheel well of my 2009 Chevy pickup, and they decided I was a problem with a price tag. 48 hours later, they learned the actual price, and it cost them everything they had. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And hit like if you believe arrogance always carries an invoice that eventually comes due. I'm 64 years old. I live alone in a 3-bedroom ranch house in a quiet stretch of central Ohio. The same house I bought with my wife 31 years ago before she passed. I keep a vegetable garden in the backyard. I drink my coffee black. I drive a truck I maintain myself. Because I've always believed a man who can't take care of his tools doesn't deserve them. To anyone who sees me at the hardware store or the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, I look like exactly what I appear to be, a retired man living simply, content with his routine. That appearance is not an accident. I built it deliberately, and I maintained it for over 20 years. 32 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. The medical bills arrived faster than I could process them. I was working construction at the time, pulling decent wages, but nothing that could absorb what we were facing. We spent 2 years fighting, and then I spent a year after losing her trying to figure out how a widowed father of a 7-year-old daughter was supposed to hold the world together. What I did was work. It's the only thing I knew. I'd spent enough years in construction to understand something the banks and the suits in the glass offices didn't always want to acknowledge. There was serious money to be made lending to small and mid-sized real estate developers who couldn't get conventional financing fast enough. Hard money lending, bridge loans, mezzanine debt. I studied it the way I used to study blueprints. All night, at the kitchen table, with my daughter asleep down the hall. I started small, ridiculously small. One loan to a developer I'd poured a foundation for, collateralized against a property I understood in my bones because I'd helped build it. He paid me back in 11 months with interest. I rolled it into a second loan, then a third. By the time my daughter started high school, I had a real book of business. I incorporated quietly. No press releases. No office with my name on a glass door. I structured the entire operation through a holding company managed by my attorney, a sharp and loyal man named Hayes, who had been with me since the beginning. As the fund grew, and it did grow steadily without spectacle, I placed my controlling interest inside an irrevocable trust that I instructed Hayes to keep entirely separate from my personal identity. By the time my daughter graduated college, the fund managed over $300 million in commercial real estate debt across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Our single largest active relationship was with a Columbus-based development group called Prescott Development. My daughter met their son at a mutual friend's barbecue 2 summers ago. She called me that night, her voice lighter than I'd heard it in years, and told me she'd met someone she wanted me to know. I met Brent 6 weeks later. He was 34, handsome in the groomed way of someone who spent money on it, and immediately interested in what I did for a living. I told him I'd worked construction most of my life and kept a modest amount in savings. He smiled at that, a patient, courteous smile he reserved for someone he'd already decided didn't matter, and moved on. I noticed everything. Over the months that followed, I watched the way Brent talked to my daughter when he thought I wasn't paying attention, not cruelly, but with the particular dismissiveness of a man who has never truly respected the person he's with, who tolerates affection the way some people tolerate a minor inconvenience. He spoke over her at dinner. He answered questions she was in the middle of answering. He referred to her plans as sweet without meaning it as a compliment. They married 14 months ago. I stood at the front of a beautiful venue outside Dublin, Ohio, and I watched my daughter walk toward a man I wasn't sure deserved her. But I held my tongue. She was an adult. She had made her choice. My job was to be there when she needed me, not to stand in the way of her own life. The invitation came in early October. Brent's parents, Reginald and Georgia, were hosting a dinner at their home in New Albany, an estate with a gated driveway and a stone fountain visible from the road. They wanted to celebrate Brent's recent promotion to Vice President of Acquisitions at Prescott Development Group. Brent delivered the invitation the way he delivered most things involving me, as a logistical update rather than a warm request. He mentioned it in passing during a Sunday visit. His is on his phone, as if inviting me were a checkbox on a form. I told him I'd be there. I drove myself to New Albany on a Thursday evening in my work truck, wearing a clean flannel shirt and the boots I've had for 11 years. I parked on the street rather than in the circular driveway. I walked to the front door and rang the bell. Reginald opened it himself. He was a large man, mid-60s, silver-haired, in the way that costs money to maintain, wearing a sport coat that probably ran 4 figures. He looked me over from the doorway, boots to collar, in the half-second assessment that wealthy people think they're too subtle to make visibly. They never are. He said it was great I could make it, and stepped aside just enough to let me pass. Georgia was in the living room, arranging something on a shelf that didn't need arranging. She turned with a bright smile and gave me the same evaluation her husband had, packaged a degree warmer. She complimented the drive over. She mentioned that New Albany could be tricky to find the first time. I had been to New Albany many times. Hayes and I had driven through this exact neighborhood in 2019 while reviewing collateral on a Prescott development loan. I said nothing. Dinner was served in a formal dining room with a table long enough that the centerpiece sat between us like a polite barricade. Brent was at the far end, glowing in the way of someone whose career had just received public validation. My daughter was beside him, quieter than usual, monitoring the room with the careful attention of someone who has learned to manage tensions she didn't create. Reginald talked. He was good at it. The kind of man who had spent decades at chambers of commerce luncheons and developer association dinners, who could fill a room with his own voice and call it conversation. He talked about the Columbus market, about an $80 million mixed-use development his company was scheduled to open in the spring, about his contacts at City Hall. He mentioned with a smooth casualness I recognized as deliberate that a man in Brent's position couldn't afford certain distractions around him. He used the word image. He talked about how perception mattered in development, who you were seen with, who was seen alongside you. He was not quite looking at me when he said it. He was almost looking at me. The check came out after the dishes were cleared. Not a personal check, a cashier's check, already made out, for $15,000. Reginald placed it on the table in front of my plate, with the flat certainty of a man who had made this kind of transaction before and expected it to work. He explained it simply. Brent was ascending. There were banking relationships, civic associations, development partnerships that required a certain caliber of family around him. The check was not an insult, he said. It was a practical solution. I could use it to relocate somewhere more comfortable. Arizona was nice. Some very reasonable retirement communities near Tucson. Georgia looked at a point above my left shoulder while her husband spoke, as if reading something off the wall behind me. I looked at my daughter. She was staring at her plate. Her jaw was tight. She hadn't known this was coming, and the fact that she was still sitting in her seat, frozen, told me more about how much control Brent had over her life than anything I'd witnessed at previous dinners. I looked at Brent. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked at his father with the expression of a man who had approved this plan in advance and was now performing mild discomfort for the sake of optics. I picked up the cashier's check. I turned it once in my hands, studying the bank routing number at the bottom. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my chest pocket. Reginald settled back in his chair, satisfied. I stood, thanked Georgia for dinner, told my daughter I'd call her in the morning, and walked out the front door to my truck. I sat in the cab for a moment in the dark at the end of the street. The houses here were large and lit from within, every window a frame for someone's version of success. I reached for my phone and scrolled to Hayes. He answered before the second ring. I told him they took the bait. I told him to pull every file we had on Prescott Development and every document related to Brent's expense authorities and acquisition approvals. Hayes said he'd start in the morning. I told him to start tonight. Brent came to my house 6 days later. He arrived in a silver Audi with a leather portfolio under his arm and the look of a man who had decided that direct action was more efficient than patience. He told me the cashier's check was just the beginning of a formal arrangement. He produced a document from the portfolio and laid it on my kitchen table. He called it a mutual agreement. It contained a non-disclosure clause covering the dinner conversation, a renunciation of any future claims to financial support from his household, and language waiving my standing to contest any financial decisions affecting my daughter's shared assets. He handed me a pen and told me to sign. He told me my daughter had agreed this was the right path. He said it the way you say something you know. The other person can't verify in the moment. I asked him if she was present when he drafted it. He said that wasn't relevant. I looked at the document for a long moment. Then I signed it, slowly with the cheap ballpoint he'd brought. I signed it because a document in which the son-in-law of the majority capital provider of your flagship real estate project attempts to legally silence that man is not a liability to me. It is a gift wrapped in his own handwriting. He snapped the portfolio shut and stood to leave. At the door, he turned around and told me there was a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Columbus project coming up in the spring. A major investor reception, city officials, the whole occasion. He said it was a private corporate event, strictly for institutional partners, and that my presence would not be appropriate. He said the word embarrassment. He said it carefully, like he'd practiced it. I told him I understood his position completely. He left without looking back. I called Hayes from the porch. He had been working through the weekend. What he had found was not what I expected. Brent had been running a systematic scheme inside Prescott Development for at least 2 years. On every acquisition deal he personally sourced, the third-party contractor invoices were inflated between 18 and 31% above documented market rates. The excess was being routed through a Delaware-registered shell LLC under a cousin's name, and from there into a personal brokerage account Brent controlled exclusively. Hayes calculated the total disbursement at just over $2.3 million. That money had come, in significant part, from project budgets funded by my lending trust. He had been stealing from me, not incidentally, not metaphorically, directly, deliberately, and for long enough that it had become routine inside a company whose largest lender was the father-in-law he was trying to buy off for $15,000. I told Hayes to compile everything and contact the FBI's white-collar crime unit in Columbus. I told him to flag the brokerage account activity to the SEC as well. Brent had partially funded it through early exercise of company stock options, which introduced securities dimensions Hayes would know how to document. Then I told him about the ribbon cutting. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leave the timing to me." My daughter called 3 days before the ceremony. She was at a gas station 2 towns over, paying cash for a coffee. Her voice was controlled the way it gets when she's been crying for hours and has run out of the kind of tears that show. She told me Brent had frozen their joint accounts the day before, after she declined to transfer her 401k into a new joint brokerage account he had opened without telling her. He'd called it a tax optimization strategy. She'd asked to review the paperwork first. He'd told her she was being paranoid and unsupportive, and that her hesitation was exactly the kind of behavior that was holding them back. I told her to drive to my house. I told her to leave her phone at the gas station and borrow the attendant's landline to call me back with her ETA. She sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours that night. I walked her through what Hayes had found. I walked her through who I actually was, not in the abstract, but with documents in front of her, the fund's founding papers, the current asset summary, the specific loan agreements, showing my trust's position as primary lender on the Columbus project her husband's father was celebrating in 4 days. She didn't speak for a long time after I finished. Then she asked me why I had never told her. I told her the same thing I'd told myself for 20 years. I wanted her to grow up knowing the value of things, not their price. I wanted her to love and be loved without money distorting every relationship around her. I had watched too many people with inherited wealth lose the ability to trust anyone fully, and I had refused to let that happen to her. I told her I was sorry I hadn't been careful enough about who got close to her through me. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, very steadily, that she wanted to be there when it happened. I told her she would be. The venue was a newly completed 16-story mixed-use building in Columbus's Short North District, retail on the lower floors, professional offices above, and a penthouse reception space at the top with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city. Prescott Development had arranged a ribbon-cutting and investor reception for nearly 400 guests, city council members, regional bank executives, commercial real estate brokers, and various civic figures who considered themselves important. The building had been financed, at primary position, by my fund to the amount of $41 million. Hayes had pulled the participation rights under the lending agreement. As controlling capital provider, I held irrevocable right of access to any formal event involving the collateralized property during the loan term. Brent had told me I was not welcome. He did not know he had no contractual authority to enforce that preference. I wore the suit I had commissioned in 2003, a charcoal wool blend I had made the week the fund crossed its first $100 million in assets under management. It had been in a cedar closet for 21 years. I had it pressed that morning at a dry cleaner on the east side of town run by a man who had known me for 15 years and did not ask questions. Hayes was already inside when I arrived, having entered as legal representative of the trust. 2 agents from the FBI's Columbus Financial Crimes Unit were positioned in an unmarked vehicle in the garage below. Hayes had spent 2 full days ensuring every filing was in sequence and every warrant was ready to execute the moment I gave the signal. I walked through the lobby at 6:57 in the evening. The security desk reviewed the participation notice Hayes had filed with venue management 3 days prior. They handed me a visitor badge and directed me to the elevators. The penthouse doors opened to champagne and string music, and 400 people performing confidence at each other. The Columbus skyline was spread behind the crowd like a backdrop someone had ordered specifically to make everyone feel consequential. I saw Brent before he saw me. He was near the center of the room, champagne flute in hand, standing with 2 men I recognized as senior partners at the regional bank, holding a secondary position on the loan, behind my fund. He was laughing with his head back. I saw Reginald and Georgia near the western window. Georgia was working the room with practiced ease, one hand light on every arm she passed. Reginald had his hand on the shoulder of a city council member, in the manner of a man reminding someone who had underwritten the occasion. I saw my daughter near the east wall, in a dark blazer, standing quietly with a glass of water. She saw me the same moment I saw her. She was pale, but she was steady. Reginald spotted me first. His expression moved through 3 stages in under 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then the particular fury of a man who believes he has been publicly disrespected by someone he paid to stay away. He excused himself and came toward me with the stride of someone who intended to handle this quickly and quietly. He got within 5 feet and stopped. I don't know what he read in my face at that distance, but it interrupted him in a way that surprise alone would not have. He told me quietly that I needed to leave, that this was a private investor event, that the check he'd given me was not a casual gesture. I reached inside my jacket and produced the card Hayes had prepared, Creamstock, my name, and the fund's full legal name printed in clean black type. I placed it in Reginald's hand. He looked at it for 4 full seconds. I watched the realization move through him, the way cold water moves through a space, filling every corner at once, finding every crack. Across the room, Brent had noticed the exchange and was already moving. Georgia had turned from her conversation, reading the shift in the room the way people do when they've spent 30 years watching deals go bad. Hayes was walking toward the AV booth in the corner. The microphone chimed twice, sharp and clean, cutting through the ambient noise of 400 conversations. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. The room turned. Hayes identified himself as legal representative of the primary lending trust on the collateralized property. He announced that the trust's principal, who held contractual right of address at any formal event involving the property, wished to speak to the investor group. He looked at me. I crossed the room in the silence that followed. I was aware of my daughter near the wall, not moving, her water glass held steady. I climbed the 2 steps to the platform and took the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to. I told the room I was sorry to interrupt what had clearly been a beautiful evening. I told them I had spent 32 years building a private commercial lending operation in Ohio, starting with a single loan to a contractor I'd worked beside on a job site, and that I had never, not once, in over 3 decades, found myself standing in front of a room like this one for a reason like this. Then I told them what Brent had done. Methodically, with specifics. The inflated invoices on 6 properties, the Delaware LLC, The $2.3 million routed over 26 months into a personal brokerage account. The document he'd brought to my kitchen table and asked me to sign. The frozen credit cards. The pressure on my daughter's retirement account. I told them that agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were currently in the building, and that the moment I finished speaking, they would be executing federal warrants. The silence in that room was the most complete I have ever stood inside. Brent came toward the stage. He was talking, loudly, to no one and everyone simultaneously, saying the documentation was misread, that the contractor agreements were complex structures his father's company used routinely, that this was a family dispute being weaponized. His voice was cracking at the edges. The champagne flute was still in his hand. Two agents stepped from the service corridor behind the AV booth. They walked with the unhurried certainty of people who know the subject is almost always too stunned to run by the time they arrive. They were right. Brent stopped talking when they reached him. He looked at the handcuffs with an expression I can only describe as total incomprehension, the look of a man who had believed, until this exact moment, that he was too clever for this outcome. Across the room, a third agent approached Reginald and Georgia and served the civil asset freeze notices Hayes had prepared, covering their personal accounts, the development company's operating accounts, and the 3 investment properties registered in Georgia's name. Georgia made a sound I won't describe in detail. It was not the sound of a woman who had been unaware of where the money was coming from. I stepped down from the platform and walked directly to my daughter. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us needed words for a long moment. Then she said quietly that it was over. I told her it was. She put her arm through mine, and we walked out of the penthouse together, past the stunned crowd, past the agents securing the exits, past the string quartet that had not yet put away their instruments, still waiting, apparently, for someone to tell them what to play next. Federal proceedings moved with the grinding patience that serious financial crimes deserve. Brent accepted a plea agreement 8 months later. 7 years federal for wire fraud and embezzlement from a financial instrument backed by federally regulated capital. His attorneys had reviewed Hayes's documentation and advised immediate cooperation. There was nothing to contest. Reginald fought harder and lost more thoroughly. Civil liability for knowingly receiving and benefiting from misallocated loan funds resulted in a judgment that exceeded the development company's remaining asset value. The company entered bankruptcy proceedings by early summer. The Columbus building, the one whose ribbon they had cut with such ceremony, was transferred to receivership and eventually sold at a court-approved discount. Georgia's investment properties were liquidated to satisfy the civil judgment. The social architecture she had built in New Albany is the kind that does not survive a sudden removal of the financial foundation underneath it. The charity boards and the garden club and the restaurant reservations vanish quickly when there is nothing left to offer in return. The women who had attended her dinner parties stopped returning calls within 90 days. She did not appear surprised by this, which suggested she had always understood, on some level, that the relationships were transactional. Last I was told, they were renting a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus. Not a bad neighborhood, not the neighborhood they had come to believe was their permanent inheritance. It's a cold morning here in central Ohio. The frost hasn't fully lifted off the garden yet. I'm sitting on the back step with a cup of coffee, watching the light come up pale and flat across the yard, and my daughter is inside making eggs the way her mother used to make them, too much butter, a preference I have never once mentioned. She moved back into her old room 7 months ago, shortly after the divorce was finalized. She's been working part-time at a legal aid clinic downtown, helping people navigate housing disputes and landlord issues. She found the position herself. She didn't ask my opinion, and I didn't offer one. She came out a few minutes ago and stood beside me without saying anything, which is the kind of quiet we've rebuilt between us over these months. The good kind, the kind without anything unsaid underneath it, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. She asked me once, not long after everything settled, whether I regretted not telling her about the fund sooner. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told her I had built something real because I refused to stop moving after the worst thing I'd ever experienced. I had structured it the way I did because I wanted her to know who she was without the weight of inherited money writing that answer for her. And I told her that the lesson I had learned too slowly was that protecting someone from one thing can leave a door open for something else entirely. She didn't accept the apology the way you accept an apology when you're still angry. She accepted it the way you do when you already know it costs something to say, and that cost is the point. Hayes calls every Tuesday with fund updates. I listen, ask a few questions, and let him run things the way he's been running them for years. The returns are consistent. The staff is careful and honest. I have no interest in stepping back into any public role. The charcoal suit is back in the cedar closet. My Carhartt jacket is on the hook by the door. Somewhere in a federal facility downstate, a man who looked at my work boots and decided I was worth $15,000 is waking up to the specific and permanent sound of a door that locks from the outside. I don't spend much time thinking about him. The garden needs turning before the first hard freeze, and there's coffee going cold in my hands, and the light over the yard right now is the kind of thing you don't find in penthouse event spaces or corporate ballrooms. It's just light, patient, quiet, and entirely indifferent to whoever imagines they own it. That is the thing about real power. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. It simply exists, silent and unhurried, and when the moment finally arrives, it is already there.